The soft, melancholic melody of a piano drifted through the quiet halls of the Alden Conservatory of Music. In a dimly lit practice room, Lena Caldwell sat at the grand piano, her fingers gliding effortlessly over the ivory keys. Each note of Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 in B-flat minor poured from her soul, filling the space with haunting beauty. Music had always been her refuge, the one constant in a life full of uncertainty. She closed her eyes, letting the melody carry her away, until buzz, 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 a sudden vibration shattered the moment. Lena never checked her phone during rehearsals. Not once. But something about this call made her pause. A sinking feeling twisted in her stomach. Hesitantly, she reached for her phone. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, until a familiar voice, urgent and breathless, filled her ears. "Lena, it's about your mother." The rest of the words blurred together. Collapse, hospital, critical. The piano keys blurred before her eyes, and then she ran. 2 days later, Lena stood in a Boston hospital, staring at the frail figure in the bed. Her mother, once so full of life, now looked impossibly small, swallowed by sterile white sheets and the rhythmic beep of monitors. Dr. Mayer adjusted his glasses, scanning the chart in his hands before finally speaking. "Without treatment, she has 3 months at best." Lena clenched her fists. "And with treatment?" "There's an experimental option," the doctor admitted. "It has shown promise, but—" Lena's heart pounded. "But what?" Dr. Mayer hesitated. "It's not covered by insurance. The cost is," he sighed, $250,000 minimum. The world seemed to tilt. Lena had spent years fighting for her place at Alden Conservatory, working toward a future where music was her entire life. But what was the point of playing for packed concert halls if she couldn't save the one person who had always believed in her? That night, she signed a temporary withdrawal from school. In the dimly lit hospital bathroom, she stared at her reflection, green eyes dull with exhaustion, long brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail, 22 years old, alone, and carrying a burden far heavier than she could bear. "I'll find a way." It wasn't a hope. It was a promise. Lena had taken on 2 waitressing jobs, stretching herself to the breaking point, but the medical bills kept piling up. The treatment clock was ticking. Tonight's shift was different. A high-profile charity gala at Hawthorne Manor, where Boston's elite gathered to sip $1,000 champagne and throw money at causes they barely understood. "Remember, no eye contact unless spoken to," the catering manager whispered, adjusting Lena's bow tie. "These people don't want to know you exist, unless they need a refill." Lena nodded, balancing a tray of crystal flutes. She stepped into the ballroom, a space drenched in gold and excess. Chandeliers sparkled overhead. Laughter and whispered deals floated through the air, mingling with the scent of expensive perfume. As she wove between the guests, she forced herself to ignore the bitter thoughts creeping in. How many months of her mother's treatment would just one of these diamond necklaces cover? How many piano lessons could she fund with the price of a single bottle of their vintage wine? She was invisible, just as she had been instructed. Until she wasn't, because in the next instant she turned and collided headfirst into him. The moment that would change everything. The moment Lena turned, she collided into something, or rather, someone, sending golden champagne cascading through the air. Time seemed to freeze. The liquid splashed onto an emerald green gown, the kind of designer couture that probably cost more than 6 months' worth of rent. Lena's stomach dropped. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, her face going pale. Instead of the expected outburst, the woman in the dress, tall, poised, with razor-sharp cheekbones and assessing eyes, merely raised an eyebrow. Well, at least it wasn't red wine. There was no anger, no irritation, just curiosity. Her name was Vivienne Sinclair. While the catering staff rushed over, dabbing at the fabric, Vivienne studied Lena with an unsettling level of interest. "What's your name, girl?" Lena swallowed. "Lena Caldwell, ma'am." Vivienne tilted her head, scrutinizing her. "You don't belong here, do you?" Lena tensed. Your posture, your diction. You're not from service staff stock. You were raised for something else. You play an instrument, I assume?" Lena blinked, caught off guard. "Yes. Piano." Vivienne smirked as if she'd expected that answer. "I can tell. Your hands." Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, Vivienne walked away, her gaze still lingering, as if she were deciding something. As the night wore on and the event wound down, Lena retreated to the kitchen, exhausted and eager to disappear. But Vivienne found her first. She approached Lena with a calm, measured grace, stepping past bustling servers. "You need money, don't you?" Her tone was casual, certain. Lena stiffened. "We all need money, Miss Sinclair." Vivienne's lips curved slightly. "Not like you do. You have the look of someone running out of time." Lena's throat tightened, but she didn't answer. Vivienne pulled out a sleek black business card. Minimalist, heavy stock, only a phone number embossed in silver. "There's an event this Friday. One evening of your time could solve problems that would take years to fix otherwise." Lena's heartbeat quickened. "What kind of event?" Vivienne smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Let's call it a meet and greet for the exceptionally rare. A place where those with refined tastes seek something unique." A chill ran down Lena's spine. The starting bid alone would be enough to cover $250,000. The exact amount Dr. Mayer had quoted for her mother's treatment. Coincidence? Or had Vivienne somehow already known? Lena clenched her fists, her mind spinning. "Think about it," Vivienne said smoothly, already walking away. "But don't take too long. Some opportunities only knock once. And some mothers don't have the luxury of time." That night, Lena sat beside her mother's hospital bed, watching the frail rise and fall of her breathing. The black card burned a hole in her pocket. She knew the world didn't offer easy choices. When the only options left were bad ones, how much of yourself would you be willing to sell? A cool September breeze swept across the Rhode Island coastline, rustling through the cliffs of Hawthorne Heights. At the end of a private drive, a grand limestone mansion loomed against the dying sunset, its golden glow almost mocking in its opulence. Lena's palms were sweating as she clutched her overnight bag. "Second thoughts are for people who have options," Vivienne murmured beside her, leading her through the massive oak doors. The past 48 hours had been a blur. Contracts, non-disclosure agreements, medical evaluations, and now, this. Lena barely recognized herself. Her exhausted, overworked appearance had been erased. In its place was a woman wrapped in silk and secrets. A vision of elegance in a form-fitting white gown, her hair swept into a delicate updo. For the first time in her life, she looked like she belonged in a world she had no business stepping into. She exhaled shakily. "This is real, isn't it?" In the mirror, Vivienne's reflection smirked knowingly. "The wealthy have peculiar appetites, darling. Some collect art, others collect experiences." She reached forward, fastening the final touch to Lena's look, a Venetian mask, delicate, laced with silver filigree, hiding everything. "Tonight, you're not a waitress, not a pianist, not a girl drowning in medical debt." Vivienne's voice dropped into a whisper. "Tonight, Lena, you're the prize." As Vivienne secured the ornate silver mask to Lena's face, she felt something unsettling. Her identity, herself, slipping away. She was no longer Lena Caldwell, the pianist. She was Lot 7. A number. A transaction. A fleeting moment in a world where people like her were never meant to exist. "The Amethyst Club never forgets its investments," Vivienne murmured, adjusting a stray lock of hair. "You'll be cared for, regardless of tonight's outcome." Cared for. As if she were some rare artifact instead of a breathing, thinking human being. The grand ballroom fell silent as Lena was led onto the small circular stage. The air was thick with wealth and secrecy. 50 men and women sat in shadowed corners, their faces hidden behind elaborate masks, their hands idly cradling crystal glasses of aged scotch and rare wine. The only source of light came from deep purple candles, casting an eerie glow that flickered against the polished marble. From somewhere unseen, a cello's mournful melody curled through the space, heavy and haunting. A voice, disembodied, smooth, practiced, drifted through hidden speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Amethyst Club, we present Lot 7. Lena stood motionless, her spine stiff, her pulse hammering against her ribs. 22 years old, classically trained pianist, untouched, certified pure. The words landed like a slap. "Bidding begins at $100,000. The first bid came immediately, then another, then another. The numbers climbed. $150,000, $200,000, $350,000. Lena felt detached from her own body. Was this still her life? Or had she stepped into some twisted fairy tale where girls were traded like priceless artifacts? The voices blurred together, numbers stacking higher and higher until 500,000. The room fell silent. The bid had come from the shadows at the back. Unlike the others, the man did not fidget, did not whisper, did not even lift his glass. He simply stood, his frame tall and commanding, his mask a simple black silk covering only his eyes. The weight of his presence swallowed the room whole. No one challenged him, not a single person dared. Going once, the auctioneer's voice echoed. Silence. Going twice. Lena squeezed her eyes shut. Sold to Mr. Blackwell for $500,000. Her knees nearly buckled. $500,000. For one night. For her. Vivienne was at her side within seconds, fingers biting into Lena's arm as she steered her away from the stage. Congratulations, she whispered. Lena's breath came too fast. Who is he? Vivienne's lips curled into something like amusement. Thorne Blackwell. Tech billionaire. Reclusive, cold, ruthless. Lena's stomach twisted. She knew that name. Blackwell Industries. A man whose empire spanned from artificial intelligence to aerospace technology. He was the type of man who bought out failing companies just to watch them burn. The type of man who didn't make careless investments. So why? Her? Don't look so terrified. Vivienne cooed, adjusting Lena's mask. The mysterious ones are usually the most gentle. Lena didn't believe that for a second. They were escorted through a hidden passageway, leading out to a private dock where a sleek obsidian black yacht awaited them. The Imperium, Vivienne announced as they approached. A fitting name. The vessel was massive, its decks bathed in soft, golden light, the kind of yacht that whispered power, control, wealth beyond comprehension. Lena's steps faltered at the gangway. I don't think I can do this. Vivienne's grip tightened painfully around her wrist. You can, and you will. Her voice was razor-sharp. Your mother's treatment has already been arranged. There's no turning back now. Lena's throat burned. No turning back. At the top of the gangway stood Thorne Blackwell himself. His mask was gone, revealing a face that was sharp, sculpted, unreadable. A jawline like cut marble, cheekbones that could shred glass, and eyes so dark they swallowed light. He didn't speak, didn't smirk, didn't offer a hand. He just watched, measured, calculated. Lena's breath caught. Mr. Blackwell. Vivienne's voice was silky. May I present? That will be all. The command was quiet, final. Vivienne hesitated for only a fraction of a second before releasing Lena's arm and stepping away. Then, she was gone, and Lena Caldwell was alone. Alone with a man who had just purchased her for the price of her mother's life. The Imperium sliced through the dark Atlantic waters, the lights of Newport shrinking behind them. Lena stood at the deck's edge, her hands gripping the polished railing, the salty breeze biting her skin through the silk of her gown. Thorne stood a few feet away, leaning against the frame of the cabin door, watching her in silence. His presence was heavy, but his voice, when it finally came, was unexpectedly quiet. Would you like to see inside? Lena turned, heart pounding against her ribs. Thorne tilted his head, gesturing to the open door. There was no arrogance in his tone, no mockery, just calm detachment, a simple question, an invitation. Lena exhaled shakily. She had no idea what awaited her beyond that door, but one thing was certain, this was no longer a transaction. This was a game, and she had just stepped onto the board. The interior of the yacht was nothing like Lena had imagined. There were no gaudy displays of power, no gold-trimmed chandeliers, no extravagant sculptures meant to impress. Just polished mahogany, cream-colored leather, and subtle lighting that cast a warm, golden glow across the room. It was understated, but somehow that made it even more powerful. This space didn't need to prove its worth. It simply was. Drink? Thorne Blackwell stood at a sleek bar, pouring himself a glass of something dark and smooth. His movements were calm, deliberate, as if he never did anything without careful calculation. Lena swallowed hard. No, thank you. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Yet she remained standing, uncertain. What were the rules for a situation like this? Were there etiquette guidelines for being purchased? Please, sit. He gestured toward a plush leather sofa. Lena hesitated before lowering herself onto the cushion, her back rigid. Thorne studied her for a long moment. The mask. She flinched at his voice. You can remove it now. Her fingers trembled as she reached behind her head, untying the delicate silk ribbons. The mask slipped away, exposing her face completely. For some reason, she felt more vulnerable now than she ever had before. Thorne's gaze didn't waver. So, he said finally, Vivienne's latest acquisition. Lena's spine stiffened. I'm not an acquisition. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. For a moment she regretted her defiance, but instead of irritation, Thorne's lips tugged slightly upward. Not quite a smile, but close. No? He tilted his head. Then what would you call it? Lena hesitated. What would she call it? A desperate gamble? A soul-crushing necessity? She exhaled sharply. A transaction. Thorne's expression shifted, his dark eyes sharpening with interest. Honest. He leaned back in his chair, still watching her intently. I appreciate that. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then suddenly, tell me about yourself. Lena's brows furrowed. I thought no personal details were allowed. Isn't that the rule? His lips barely moved. My money. My rules. A flicker of frustration rose in Lena's chest. Why are you here, really? The question, so simple, so impossible to answer fully, felt like a blow to the ribs. Something inside her cracked. Maybe it was his tone, lacking both judgment and cruelty. Maybe it was the weight of the past few months pressing against her like an unbearable force. But whatever the reason, Lena felt her throat tighten. And then, to her horror, tears spilled down her cheeks. I'm sorry. Her voice wavered, hands shaking as she quickly wiped at her face. This isn't, I don't usually. She turned away, humiliated. Crying in front of a man like Thorne Blackwell? Pathetic. But when she finally dared to look at him again, his expression had changed entirely. The cool indifference was gone. In its place was something else. Something that almost looked like pain. He was staring at her tears as if they were telling him a story he had once lived himself. And then, your mother is ill. His voice was quiet. It wasn't a question, it was a fact. Lena froze. How did you? Thorne turned, walking toward the large window overlooking the ocean. I make it my business to know things. His tone was distant now. Experimental treatment, insurance denial, medical bankruptcy looming. Lena clenched her fists. How much did he know? Her silence must have confirmed his suspicions, because he let out a humorless chuckle. And Vivienne found you. His voice hardened. She always knows where to look for desperation. Lena's pulse thundered in her ears. Was that what she was? Nothing but desperation wrapped in silk? What did she promise you? Thorne's voice was low now. That it would be just one night? That you'd never have to see the buyer again? That you could wash it all away afterward? Lena swallowed thickly. Something like that. But something wasn't right. This wasn't following the script she had prepared for. Thorne Blackwell wasn't doing what men in his position were supposed to do. Instead, he turned back to face her. I'm going to make you a different offer. Lena's breath caught. I don't understand. This, he gestured between them, isn't happening. Not tonight, not ever. Relief flooded her. And then, panic. But the money, my mother's treatment, will be taken care of. His voice was final, but not like this. Lena's mind whirled. What was he saying? How could she possibly walk away from the only solution she had? Thorne strode toward his desk, pulling out a thick folder and placing it in front of her. A contract. 1 year as my personal assistant. Lena's brows furrowed. What? Salary $300,000. Health benefits including full medical coverage for immediate family, housing provided, first installment paid immediately. Lena's stomach flipped. She stared at the documents, certain she was misunderstanding. Why? Thorne's jaw tightened. Because I don't buy women. His voice was sharp. And because those tears tell me everything I need to know about your character. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. You can tell my character from my tears? I can tell that you're here against your will, but driven by love. His dark eyes locked onto hers. That makes you loyal, determined, principled. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. Was this another kind of trap? A different form of ownership? Or was it something else entirely? Lena's fingers hovered over the contract. Her entire future balanced on this moment. She took a deep breath and signed her name. Exactly what it says. Scheduling, correspondence, travel arrangements. Nothing inappropriate. Lena narrowed her eyes. And if I refuse? Thorne Blackwell's expression hardened. Then I call your bluff. You walk away tonight with nothing. The air between them grew heavy. How desperate are you, Lena Carter, from the New York Conservatory of Music? Her blood ran cold at the mention of her name and school. He knew. He had done his research. Lena swallowed hard. Why go through the auction then? She asked. Why not just offer me a job? For the first time, Blackwell hesitated. He looked uncomfortable, almost as if the question had struck something deep. I have my reasons for attending Amethyst Club events, he said finally. Reasons that don't concern you. Dawn was breaking when they arrived back at the harbor. The contract was signed. The first payment had already been transferred to her account. It was done. As she stepped off the yacht, Blackwell handed her a small business card. My driver will collect you Thursday morning. Pack for Nantucket. The season's ending, so it'll be quiet. A good place to start. Lena studied his face in the soft golden light of morning. Handsome, guarded, carrying secrets she couldn't begin to decipher. Why me? She asked, the question burning on her tongue. Blackwell's gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through his dark eyes. Because sometimes saving one person is the only redemption possible. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Nantucket in late September felt like a town exhaling. The summer crowds were gone, leaving behind quiet streets and empty beaches. Lena pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the car window, watching the gray waves crash against the shore. 2 days had passed in a blur. Her mother had been transferred to Whitmore Clinic, one of Boston's most prestigious hospitals. Specialists had been consulted, treatment had been scheduled, and Lena had barely lifted a finger, beyond signing the authorization forms. She should have felt relieved, but instead, unease coiled in her stomach like a tight knot. Almost there, miss, the driver announced, turning onto a private road flanked by wind-twisted trees. The Blackwell estate appeared suddenly around a bend. A sprawling mansion perched on a cliffside overlooking the Atlantic. Not ostentatious like the gilded palaces of Newport, but undeniably commanding. It had the kind of weathered grace that suggested generations of quiet wealth. Lena had the unsettling sense that the house had secrets, and she was about to walk straight into them. A stern-faced woman stood at the entrance, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, her spine straight as a ruler. "Welcome to Windward," she said crisply. "I'm Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper. Mr. Blackwell is in New York until tomorrow. I'll show you to your quarters." Lena followed her inside, trying not to gawk. The interior was just as imposing as the exterior. Hardwood floors softened by antique rugs, walls adorned with nautical maps and stormy seascapes. There were windows everywhere, framing the wild ocean beyond. But one thing was missing. No photos, no personal touches. It was as if Thorne Blackwell didn't exist outside of his business empire. "No photographs," Lena murmured, more to herself than to Mrs. Winters. "Mr. Blackwell values his privacy." A shiver ran down her spine. Her quarters turned out to be larger than the entire apartment she'd once shared with her mother. A sitting room with a fireplace, a bedroom with a 4-poster bed, and a bathroom of gleaming white marble. It was too much. "Dinner is at 7, Mrs. Winters informed her. "Business attire during working hours. Mr. Blackwell values punctuality." Then she turned on her heel and left. Lena stood frozen, taking in this surreal moment. Just days ago, she had been juggling waitressing shifts between hospital visits. And now, she was in a mansion that belonged in a period drama, employed by a man she barely knew. A man who had spent $500,000, apparently just to rescue her from herself. She sank onto the window seat, staring out at the stormy Atlantic. "People don't just do that," a voice whispered in her head. "There's always a price." Dinner was a solitary affair in a formal dining room large enough to seat 20. Mrs. Winters served each course with military precision, her sharp gaze offering no warmth. "How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwell?" Lena tried, desperate for conversation. "A long time." "What's he like?" Mrs. Winters' knife paused mid-cut, just for a fraction of a second. "He's a private man." Lena frowned. "He said he needed an assistant. But I don't understand. Why me? Why go through all this trouble?" Mrs. Winters finally met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps you should ask him that yourself." A chill slid down Lena's spine. She suddenly felt very, very small in this house full of shadows. And in that moment, she realized something. She had stepped into something much bigger than herself. And she had no idea how deep it went. Lena took a slow sip of water, watching Mrs. Winters across the vast dining table. "How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwell?" She tried again, hoping for more than the clipped responses she'd been receiving. "Long enough." Lena fought the urge to sigh. "Is he here often?" Mrs. Winters' knife paused for the briefest second before she continued cutting her meat. Mr. Blackwell maintains residences in several locations. His schedule is not your concern unless he makes it so. The finality in her tone was clear. By the third failed attempt at conversation, Lena gave up and focused on the undeniably delicious food. But even as she ate, restless energy coiled inside her. She needed to move, to explore, to do something other than sit and stew over the countless unanswered questions surrounding Thorne Blackwell. After dinner, Lena wandered through the East Wing, trailing her fingers lightly over the intricate moldings of the hallways. Most of the rooms were locked offices, cold and impersonal. But then she found the library, and it took her breath away. Towering bookshelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, filled with thousands of books. A large bay window created a cozy reading nook, complete with a cushioned window seat overlooking the sea. But it wasn't the books or the view that stopped her in her tracks. It was the piano. A Steinway grand. Its polished lid closed like a sleeping giant. Without conscious thought, Lena found herself seated at the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys. Would anyone hear her? Would it matter if they did? Taking a deep breath, she pressed the first note. It was tentative at first, then gaining confidence. The room filled with the melancholy beauty of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Lena closed her eyes, letting the weight of weeks of stress and fear pour into the music. And for a moment, she forgot where she was. She forgot about her mother's illness, about Thorne Blackwell, about everything. She was just a girl and her piano, a girl playing as if the music could save her. Opus 9, number 2. Interesting choice. Lena's hands crashed onto the keys in discord. Heart hammering, she whipped around. There, in the doorway, stood Thorne Blackwell. Still in his travel coat, his eyes shadowed, his expression impossible to read. I didn't ask permission, she stammered, rising quickly. Don't stop on my account, he said smoothly, shrugging off his coat and draping it over a chair. He poured amber liquid into a crystal tumbler and leaned against the bar, watching her. You play beautifully. Lena blinked. That was not what she'd expected him to say. I thought you weren't returning until tomorrow, she said cautiously. Plans changed. He took a sip of his drink, then gestured toward the piano. Please continue. Lena hesitated. Play? For him? She settled back onto the bench, this time choosing Bach, structured, mathematical, less emotionally revealing. Blackwell settled into a leather armchair, eyes closed, listening. Not just hearing the notes, listening. Lena could feel it, as if he were unraveling her through the music itself. When she finished, silence stretched between them, so long that she wondered if he'd fallen asleep. Then finally, he spoke. Your technique is flawless. Lena felt a flicker of pride until his next words. But you're holding back. Her spine stiffened. Excuse me? He leaned forward slightly, eyes dark and knowing. With Chopin, you played from the heart. With Bach, you were just hitting notes. Lena bristled. I wasn't aware I was auditioning. A ghost of a smile flickered across his lips. Defensive. Interesting. He stood, adjusting his cuffs. Tomorrow we start work, 8 a.m. sharp. My office is across from the library. As he passed, the scent of his cologne, woodsy, expensive, briefly surrounded her. For an instant, their eyes met, and Lena glimpsed something unexpected in his gaze. Not desire, not appraisal, but recognition, as if he saw something in her that resonated with something in himself. Then, suddenly, his phone rang, shattering the moment. Blackwell, he answered sharply, already striding from the room, his tone all business. Lena was left alone in the silent library. She ran her fingers lightly over the piano keys, still tingling from the brief but charged interaction. What was she doing here, really? What did Thorne Blackwell actually want from her? And why did she feel like she had just passed a test she hadn't even known she was taking? Later, lying in bed, listening to the distant crash of waves, Lena couldn't sleep. Her mind was spinning. Thorne Blackwell, a man who bought women but didn't touch them. A man who recognized classical compositions by ear. A man who saw through her musical defenses with disturbing ease. He was an enigma. And Lena had the uneasy feeling that Windward House was more than just a place of employment. She was walking into something much bigger than herself, and she wasn't sure she'd come out the same person. 3 weeks into her strange new life, Lena had settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with coffee in the kitchen. Mrs. Winters had softened marginally after discovering Lena's habit of making her own bed, despite the housekeeping staff. Days were filled with organizing Blackwell's chaotic schedule, filtering calls, and keeping up with his impossible pace. And every night, she found herself drawn back to the library, back to the Steinway Grand. Because when she played, it was the only time she felt like herself. And each night, she had the uneasy feeling that somewhere in the house, Thorne Blackwell was listening. Silent, watching, waiting, for what she didn't know. But she was starting to suspect that whatever game she'd been pulled into, it had only just begun. Lena had begun to understand the rhythm of working for Thorne Blackwell. Her days were filled with fielding calls from executives too intimidated to approach him directly, preparing briefings on potential acquisitions, and managing his ever-changing schedule of high-stakes meetings. But despite being at the center of his world, the man himself remained an enigma. Present, yet distant. Demanding, yet surprisingly patient when she made mistakes. And what unsettled her most, he never mentioned the circumstances of their first meeting. He treated her with professional courtesy that, at times, bewilderingly verged on respect. Until one afternoon when he strode into the office and dropped a folder on her desk. "You'll need formal attire for tomorrow," he announced. Lena looked up, startled. "Is there a problem?" His eyebrow arched slightly, as if she had asked something absurd. "We're attending the Whitmore Clinic benefit in Boston." She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "That's my mother's hospital." "I'm aware." The words were calm, factual, as if it was obvious. "The Blackwell Foundation is a major donor," he continued, flipping through a document. "You'll accompany me as my assistant. Your background in music will be useful. These events always feature painful performances requiring polite conversation afterward." Lena almost missed the implication buried in his explanation. She would get to see her mother. "Thank you," she whispered. Thorne waved away her gratitude, not even looking up. "Your performance merits the reward. You've reorganized systems my previous 3 assistants couldn't comprehend." That night, she found a designer dress hanging in her closet. Midnight blue, elegantly simple. As she studied her reflection in the mirror, Lena barely recognized herself. The dark circles under her eyes had faded. Regular meals had restored some fullness to her face. Even her hair shone again, falling in soft waves past her shoulders. It was as if she was being slowly rebuilt, piece by piece. The Hawthorne Hotel ballroom glittered with wealth and influence. Lena moved slightly behind Thorne, notebook in hand, the perfect professional shadow. But here, in this setting, he wasn't the detached and calculating businessman she worked for. He was something else entirely, charming when necessary, commanding without effort, navigating conversations with strategic precision, like a man who always knew the next move on the chessboard. Lena had no illusions. This wasn't the true Thorne Blackwell, but it was a version of him he wanted the world to see. Thorne Blackwell, the prodigal returns to society. The voice cut through the pleasant chatter, laced with hostility. A man in his 40s, handsome but predatory, with salt and pepper hair, approached with the confidence of someone who never expected to hear the word no. Thorne's jaw tensed slightly, but his posture remained relaxed. "Maxwell." Lena didn't miss the edge of ice in his tone. "I wasn't aware the Whitmore still accepted your donations after the insider trading allegations." Maxwell's smile tightened, but he didn't waver. "All dismissed, as you well know." His sharp gaze turned to Lena. He took her hand, holding it longer than necessary. "And who is this?" "My assistant," Thorne said smoothly. "Miss Caldwell." Lena stiffened under Maxwell's scrutiny. "Assistant?" He sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "How disappointingly professional." Thorne used to have more interesting tastes in companions. Something dangerous flashed in Thorne's eyes. "Miss Caldwell, would you mind getting me a scotch? Neat." The dismissal was clear, but Lena welcomed the escape. At the bar, as she waited for the drink, she glanced back at the 2 men in deep conversation. Maxwell was leaning in, a smirk on his lips, while Thorne's expression had hardened into granite. "Those 2 have history," the bartender remarked, following her gaze. Lena turned, intrigued. "What kind of history?" He polished a glass, lowering his voice. "Old partners turned rivals. Rumor has it they nearly destroyed each other over some deal gone bad." Lena looked back at them, a strange feeling curling in her stomach. By the time Lena returned with the drink, Maxwell was gone. Thorne's composure had returned, but a thin thread of tension still lingered in his shoulders. "Everything all right?" she asked hesitantly. He drained half the scotch in one swallow, then finally met her gaze. "You have 30 minutes to visit your mother." Lena froze. "I've arranged private access. Meet me back here for the foundation announcements." She didn't ask how. She didn't ask why. She just ran. Her mother's room was quiet, filled only with the soft beeping of monitors. But Catherine Caldwell looked stronger. Her color had returned. The experimental treatment, though exhausting, was working. "He seems intimidating, your new boss." Lena smiled slightly, choosing her words carefully. "He is." "But," Lena hesitated. "But, also not what I expected." Her mother's knowing smile proved she was still perceptive despite her illness. "Just be careful, sweetheart." Lena frowned. "Why?" Catherine reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. Men with that much power usually want something in return. As Lena hurried back to the ballroom, her mother's words echoed in her mind. She had never questioned why Thorne Blackwell had done what he did, why he had paid for her mother's treatment, why he had pulled her into his world. But now, as she spotted him across the room, towering over the crowd, effortlessly commanding every conversation, Lena realized something unsettling. He had never once told her what he wanted from her in return, and that made her wonder, what game was she really playing? And more importantly, was she already too deep to escape? Lena paused outside the mahogany door, left slightly ajar. Thorne's voice, low and hard, drifted from inside. "I've been investigating you for months." She held her breath. "The Amethyst Club isn't just your personal playground, Maxwell. I know what happens to this specialty merchandise after your private auctions." There was a long pause before Maxwell's amused drawl answered. "Accusations without evidence are just hot air, Thorne. Though I must say I'm curious, why the personal interest? Your new assistant, perhaps? She seems unusually refined for her position." Lena's stomach twisted. "Stay away from her," Thorne warned. "This is between us." "Nothing is just between us anymore, not since Vienna." Lena backed away, heart hammering in her chest. Vienna? The Amethyst Club? Specialty merchandise? What was she caught up in? The rest of the gala passed in a haze. The drive back to Nantucket was silent, Thorne staring out at the darkness, his shoulders rigid with unspoken tension. But Lena couldn't let it go. That night, unable to sleep, she slipped into the library. The large mahogany desk held a sleek desktop computer, used mainly for cataloging books. She hesitated for only a moment before typing into the search bar, Maxwell Reeves, Thorne Blackwell, Vienna, scandal. The search yielded financial articles from nearly a decade prior, a collapsed biotech investment, accusations of stolen research, a lawsuit settled out of court, but nothing that explained the visceral hatred she had witnessed in Thorne's voice. She tried again. Amethyst Club, Boston. Nothing. Just advertisements for crystal healing and overpriced jewelry stores. Midnight research isn't part of your job description. Lena jumped, heart lodging in her throat. Thorne stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Dressed in a t-shirt and pajama pants, he looked younger, more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "I couldn't sleep," she managed. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Lena," he said quietly. He stepped forward, glancing at the screen she hadn't closed in time. "Especially about things that don't concern you." She lifted her chin. "You were arguing about the club where we met. That does concern me." For a moment something flickered in his expression. Respect, maybe, or wariness. "There are things you're better off not knowing," he murmured. "Because you're investigating them?" Thorne let out a short, startled laugh. "Hardly. I'm just a man with unfinished business." With a single, decisive click, he closed the browser window. "Go to bed, Lena." But as she brushed past him, his hand caught her wrist. The touch wasn't firm. It was gentle. "Be careful around Maxwell Reeves. If he approaches you, tell me immediately." Lena swallowed hard, their eyes locked. For one breathless second, she felt it, that strange current between them. Not quite attraction, not quite fear, but something equally powerful. "What are you really doing, Thorne?" she whispered. His grip tightened slightly as if considering his answer. "Trying to right an old wrong." And then he let her go. "Go before I say more than I should." The morning fog clung to the Nantucket shoreline like a burial shroud, obscuring the boundary between sea and sky. Lena jogged along the private beach, her thoughts as turbulent as the waves crashing beside her. 2 months had passed since the Boston Gala. 2 months of what? building something that felt almost like trust between her and Thorne. Their working relationship had shifted from cold professional detachment to something more nuanced. He relied on her now. He even sought her opinion on business matters outside her expertise. In the evenings, they sometimes shared the library. He with his financial reports, she with books from his extensive collection. And on rare occasions, they spoke of music, the one subject that animated him beyond business. And sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, he watched her, as if he was trying to figure something out, or perhaps trying to figure out himself. Lena barely had time to process what was happening before Mrs. Winter's voice interrupted her morning. "Miss Caldwell, Mr. Blackwell requires you in his study immediately." Something in the housekeeper's tone sent a prickle of unease through Lena. Mrs. Winters had gradually warmed to her over the months, even offering occasional insights into Thorne's habits and preferences. But today, her face was carefully blank, a warning in itself. When Lena stepped into the study, Thorne stood rigidly by the window, his broad silhouette outlined against the misty light filtering through the glass. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, closing the door behind her. He turned, and the cold fury in his eyes made her instinctively step back. Without a word, he tossed a manila envelope onto the desk. Lena hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a stack of photographs. Surveillance photos, grainy but clear enough. Her, sitting in a Boston cafe across from Vivienne Chase. One image captured them mid-conversation, leaning in close. Another, Vivienne passing her a slip of paper. Thorne's voice was quiet, but it cut sharper than any yell. "You've been reporting to her." Not a question, an accusation, a sentence. Lena's stomach dropped. "It's not what it looks like." His bitter laugh stopped her cold. "Because it looks like my assistant has been feeding information to a woman connected to the very organization I've been investigating." Lena's pulse roared in her ears. "Investigating for what, Thorne?" she countered, finding her voice. "You've never told me what this is all about." His jaw clenched. "And naturally, you kept this meeting secret from me." Lena exhaled sharply, frustration overtaking fear. "I didn't think. That's obvious." He picked up another photograph. This one showed her pocketing the note Vivienne had given her. "What's on the note, Lena?" She hesitated. And that was answer enough. "I trusted you." It wasn't the anger in his voice that cut her. It was the quiet disappointment. "I brought you into my home, gave you access to my files, my schedule, my private communications. Thorne, please just let me explain." "Don't." He held up a hand, shutting her down. His tone was clinical, emotionless. "The car will take you to Boston this afternoon. Your personal belongings will be packed and forwarded. Your final paycheck includes the remainder of the year's salary as contracted." Lena's breath caught. "You're firing me? Without even hearing my side?" Finally, his control cracked. "Your side?" The words lashed through the air. For the first time, raw betrayal bled through his mask. "I saved you from that auction, paid for your mother's treatment, gave you a position far beyond your qualifications. And this is how you repay me?" Lena flinched. "By meeting once with the woman who put me in that situation?" "Yes, I should have told you," she shot back. "But you kept me in the dark about everything. Your investigation, your history with Maxwell, why you were at that auction in the first place." Thorne's hand slammed onto the desk. Lena jumped. "Because I was trying to protect you." The words hung between them, shifting the air in the room. Lena's voice dropped to a whisper. "Protect me from what?" He turned away, dragging a hand through his hair, visibly reasserting his composure. "It doesn't matter now." Something inside her cracked. Was it pride? Or was it the fragile hope that what had been growing between them was more than just employer and employee? Lena straightened her spine. "Fine," she said, voice steady, even as her eyes burned with unshed tears. "But for the record, Vivienne contacted me because she's being blackmailed by Maxwell Reeves." Thorne's head snapped up. Lena pressed on. "She's terrified. That note? It had an address where she claims Maxwell keeps records of all the Amethyst Club transactions." A long silence, a shift in Thorne's expression. Doubt, calculation, a flicker of something else. And just for a moment, Lena allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Lena's hand trembled as she set her security pass on Thorne Blackwell's desk. "Goodbye, Mr. Blackwell." She turned, voice thick with disappointment. I hope whatever crusade you're on is worth the collateral damage. Thorne didn't stop her. Didn't call her back. Didn't even flinch. The drive to Boston blurred past in silent tears and angry self-recrimination. Had she really thought Thorne would trust her over evidence that, admittedly, looked damning? Had she been so naive to believe their connection meant something beyond convenience? As the car wove through the city streets, Lena made a decision. She wasn't going home. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out the crumpled slip of paper Vivienne had given her, an address. A place Vivienne had claimed held proof of Maxwell Reeves' operations. I deserve to know the truth. The location led to an upscale office building in Boston's financial district. It looked ordinary. Too ordinary. There was minimal security. Strange for a Sunday. Using the directory inside, she found Reeves Consulting listed on the top floor. An elevator keycard was required, but before she could turn away, a man in a suit held the door for her. "Going up?" he asked, smiling. Something about him was off. It took Lena a second too long to place him. One of Maxwell's associates. From the gala. Too late, cold realization set in. She'd walked straight into a trap. "Miss Caldwell," the man said pleasantly as the elevator doors slid shut. "Mr. Reeves has been hoping you'd accept his invitation." Lena's stomach dropped. She reached for the buttons, but his hand closed around her wrist, steel strong. "Oh, I think you know exactly what this is about," he murmured, voice light. Lena yanked at his grip, panic flaring. "Let me go." A sudden sharp prick against her neck. Her vision blurred. Her legs buckled, and the last thing she saw was his bland, professional smile transforming into something predatory. "Don't worry," he whispered as the world went dark. "You're still quite valuable merchandise." Consciousness returned in fragments. The scratch of rough fabric against her cheek, the distant hum of machinery, a throbbing ache at the base of her skull. Lena forced her eyes open, blinking away the fog. The room swayed, then steadied. Concrete floors, exposed brick walls, high, wire-reinforced windows, a single metal door. She was trapped. She's awake. The voice was female, low and matter-of-fact. Lena turned her head. A woman sat across the room, hollow-cheeked but sharp-eyed. Not a prisoner who had given up, a prisoner waiting. "I'm Cassie," she said. Lena tried to sit up, only to feel sharp plastic biting into her wrists. Her hands were zip-tied. Cassie didn't bother looking concerned. "Don't waste your energy," she advised. "They check them every hour." Lena's throat was dry. "Where are we?" "An old textile factory in Providence," Cassie replied. "Reeves uses it for storage." Her bitter smile made Lena's stomach tighten when merchandise becomes complicated. The room was nothing more than a holding cell. 2 thin mattresses, a bucket in the corner, no windows within reach. One metal door with a tiny observation panel. Lena forced herself to breathe. "How long have you been here?" Cassie exhaled, stretching her legs to reveal similar restraints around her ankles. 3 weeks, maybe 4, I lost track." Lena's heart pounded. "How did you get here?" Cassie shrugged. "Lot 4, auction in New York." Lena felt sick. What happened? Buyer got cold feet when he realized I wasn't exactly there willingly. Cold fear settled in Lena's stomach. "So they returned you?" Cassie's smile was void of humor. "Reeves doesn't like refunds." Lena swallowed hard. "They're human traffickers?" Cassie tilted her head, studying Lena. Then she laughed. Not with amusement, but with exhaustion. Among other things, Lena's blood ran cold. "The auctions are just the public face," Cassie explained. "The real money is in moving girls internationally. Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, private islands with no extradition." The room tilted as the implications hit Lena all at once. This was what Thorne had been investigating. This was what he had tried to shield her from. And she had walked right into it. Cassie watched understanding dawn on Lena's face. "You didn't know?" she asked, almost curious. Lena shook her head, speechless. She had thought she knew what the Amethyst Club was. She had thought she was prepared. She had been wrong. "Welcome to the real Amethyst Club, sweetheart," Cassie murmured. "Let's hope someone gives enough of a damn to come looking for you." Lena sat motionless, her mind racing. She had walked straight into this. Driven by hurt pride and wounded feelings, she had handed herself over to the enemy. "Someone will come looking for me," she murmured, not just to reassure Cassie, but to reassure herself. Thorne had to be searching for her. Cassie exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You're Blackwell's pet project." Lena's eyes snapped to her. "What?" They talk about you, Cassie said, watching her carefully. Reeves has been obsessed with getting to him through you for weeks. Lena barely had time to process this before the door scraped open. A shadow fell across the room. Maxwell Reeves. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he looked obscenely out of place in the squalid surroundings. A predator who had no need to raise his voice to assert dominance. "Miss Caldwell," he greeted smoothly, a thin, cold smile never reaching his ruthless eyes. "Apologies for the accommodations. Merely temporary, I assure you." Lena met his gaze steadily, refusing to show fear. "What do you want?" His smile widened. "Direct. I appreciate that." He pulled a folding chair from the hallway, positioned it before her with careful precision, and sat. Then, in a casual tone, he said, "What I want is quite simple. Information about Thorne Blackwell's investigation into my business interests." Lena's stomach clenched. He was fishing for evidence. She swallowed hard, keeping her expression blank. "I don't know anything about any investigation." Maxwell tilted his head, almost pitying. "Come now." He leaned forward, voice deceptively patient. "You've been his shadow for months, accessing his files, handling his correspondence, practically living in his pocket." His eyes narrowed. "What evidence has he collected? Who is he working with? FBI? Private security?" The questions confirmed what Lena had only half suspected. Thorne wasn't just investigating. He was building a case. And he was getting dangerously close to something. "He doesn't confide in me," Lena insisted. "I'm just his assistant." Maxwell studied her carefully, then smiled, a slow, satisfied smile. "You really don't know, do you?" Lena stiffened. "Know what?" He stood, straightening his cuffs. "No matter." His tone turned almost bored. "Your value isn't in what you know, but in what Blackwell feels for you." Lena's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Maxwell chuckled, his voice dropping into a confidential murmur. "I've known Thorne since he was a brash young entrepreneur with more ambition than sense. He hides it well, but he's predictable in one respect. He develops attachments." Lena froze. "Attachments?" "Messy, inconvenient, dangerous." Maxwell circled behind her, his voice low and measured. 8 years ago in Vienna, it was a brilliant young scientist whose research I acquired through unconventional means. Thorne played White Knight. His testimony nearly destroyed me. But you see, evidence has a way of disappearing when the right palms are greased. His fingers dug into Lena's shoulders, making her flinch. "Now, it's you. The damsel he rescued from the auction block." "He fired you, didn't he?" Maxwell's voice was almost sympathetic. "Cast you out when he thought you betrayed him." Lena stared ahead, refusing to react. "And yet," Maxwell continued, his grip loosening, "I guarantee he's already regretting it. Already mobilizing to find you." Alarm bells rang in Lena's mind. "You're using me as bait." Maxwell stepped back, grinning. "Smart girl." Maxwell exhaled dramatically. "Blackwell has been building a case for months. Electronic surveillance, financial traces, witness testimony." His voice dropped into a whisper. "But he's made one critical mistake. He's allowed himself to care. And when we dangle you as the prize," he smiled, "he'll come." Lena's blood ran cold. "No." She shook her head. "He won't." "I was just an employee, a charity case." Maxwell laughed. "You don't believe that any more than I do. I've watched you both for months." His gaze turned almost amused. "The way he looks at you when he thinks no one sees, it's almost touching." Lena's chest tightened because somewhere deep inside, a small, terrified part of her wondered if Maxwell was right. After Maxwell left, Lena slumped against the wall, mind racing. Had there been something growing between her and Thorne? Something beyond professional respect? The quiet evenings in the library, the way he listened to her opinions, the subtle ways he found to show that he valued her. Were those just kindnesses, or something deeper? And if Thorne did care enough to come for her, she was leading him straight into a trap. "Don't beat yourself up," Cassie said, breaking the silence. Her voice was flat, but not unkind. "Reeves is a master manipulator." She leaned back against the wall, eyes dark. "It's how he lures girls to the auctions. How he keeps people in check." Lena swallowed hard. She had two choices: wait to be used as bait, or find a way to warn Thorne before it was too late. Time was running out. Lena's heart pounded as she processed the guard's words. Thorne was here, and Maxwell was ready for him. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a trap. "I need access to the PA system," Lena said urgently. The guard's expression hardened. That's not the plan. Forget the plan, she hissed. Maxwell expects Thorne to walk into his ambush. If I can warn him, too dangerous. More dangerous than letting him die? The guard hesitated. Cassie, who had remained silent, suddenly spoke. She's right, she said. If they kill Blackwell, no one stops Reeves. No one shuts this down. A muscle ticked in the guard's jaw. Fine, he muttered, but if you slow us down, you're on your own. Lena nodded. That was all she needed. They moved quickly through the lower levels. Through gaps in the machinery, Lena saw glimpses of Maxwell's men. Armed, ready, waiting. Then, the first explosion shook the walls. A distraction. Thorne's team had made their move. That's our cue, the guard murmured. They reached an old metal staircase, rusted and groaning under their weight. PA room's through there, he pointed. Lena raced ahead, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Inside, dust coated the ancient control panel, but the microphone was still intact. She snatched it up and pressed the intercom switch. Thorne, if you can hear me, it's a trap. Maxwell knows you're here. He's waiting on the main floor. Do not. The door burst open. A guard tackled her, wrenching the mic from her hands. Her head hit the panel, sending a piercing feedback screech through the speakers. Outside, the factory erupted into chaos. Gunfire, shouting. The unmistakable sound of Thorne Blackwell's arrival. Lena barely had time to brace herself before a fist connected with her jaw, and everything went black. When she came to, she was on the main floor. Her wrists were bound again, this time in metal cuffs. Cassie was nowhere in sight. And before her, Maxwell stood, calm and collected, a pistol resting in his hand. Across from him, Thorne. His clothes were dirtied, his face shadowed with rage. But he was alive, and his gun was aimed directly at Maxwell's head. Let her go, Thorne ordered. Maxwell smirked. You came for her after all. Thorne's grip tightened on his weapon. This ends tonight, Reeves. Maxwell chuckled, tilting his head. Does it? You break into my facility, gun down my men. Do you think that makes you the hero in this story? I don't care what story you tell yourself, Thorne replied coldly. Lena, come here. Lena tried to move, but Maxwell's fingers tightened on her shoulder. Not so fast, he murmured. Then, the barrel of his gun pressed against her ribs. Lena froze. Thorne's eyes darkened. Shoot me, Maxwell said smoothly, and you lose her. Just like Vienna. A sharp intake of breath from Thorne. Lena stared at him, the weight of Maxwell's words hitting her. Vienna. The scientist, the one Thorne had tried to save, the one he'd failed. Thorne's finger tensed on the trigger. Maxwell smirked. Go ahead, Thorne. A single gunshot rang out. Maxwell's body jerked, and Lena hit the ground just as the factory lights flickered out. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. Sirens wailed in the distance. Lena felt strong arms lifting her, pressing her against a warm, solid chest. Lena, Thorne's voice was hoarse. Are you hurt? She blinked up at him, dazed. You killed him. Thorne's jaw tightened. I wasn't going to let him take you. Something cracked open inside her at the raw emotion in his voice. Lena reached up, brushing her fingers against his face. You came for me. Thorne's grip on her tightened. Of course I did. 3 days later, the news broke. Maxwell Reeves was dead, his trafficking operation exposed. Survivors, including Cassie, were rescued. Lena sat on the beach, waves lapping at the shore. Thorne stood beside her, silent. What happens now? She asked. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, but I do know this. He turned to face her. I can't lose you again. Lena's breath hitched. You never did. And when he closed the distance between them, tilting her chin up, she let herself fall. The gunfire ripped through the factory, shattering the air like thunder. Lena barely had time to process Thorne's apology before he pushed her toward the exit, his grip firm but not unkind. Get her out of here, he ordered his men, but Lena dug her heels in, twisting out of the operative's grasp. No, she shouted over the chaos. You can't just stay behind. Thorne didn't look back. Go, Lena. That's an order. Then he was gone. Cassie grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the exit. We need to move. Now. Lena's heart screamed at her to turn around, to fight beside him, but her brain knew better. She couldn't save Thorne if she got captured again. The group raced through the narrow corridors, their steps pounding against the concrete floor. Behind them, gunfire erupted again. Get to the van, the agent shouted. Leading them toward a side exit, they burst through the doors into the cold night air, only to find 2 of Maxwell's men waiting for them. Lena skidded to a stop as one of them raised his gun. A shot rang out, The man crumpled before he could pull the trigger. Lena whirled around. Thorne stood at the threshold, gun raised, eyes burning. "Run!" he roared. Cassie yanked her forward, and they bolted for the van. An agent threw the door open, shoving them inside. As soon as Lena's feet left the ground, the vehicle roared to life, peeling out onto the empty road. She turned in time to see Thorne still standing in the doorway, his figure framed by the burning lights of the factory. And then, he vanished into the shadows. The safe house was a small estate outside of Boston, secured by Thorne's team. Lena barely remembered the drive. Her mind was stuck in that factory, on the look in Thorne's eyes before she'd lost sight of him. She sat on the couch, gripping a cup of untouched tea, staring at the clock. "He'll come," Cassie reassured her. Lena didn't answer. Then, the door burst open. Thorne strode inside, alive but battered, blood staining his sleeve. Lena jumped to her feet, her breath catching. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without thinking, she crossed the room in 2 strides and threw her arms around him. Thorne stiffened, then melted into her touch, his hands gripping her tightly. "You're insane," she whispered, voice breaking. He let out a breathless laugh, pressing his forehead to hers. "I thought I lost you," he murmured. Lena swallowed, heart racing. "You almost did." His hand found her cheek, tilting her face up. "I won't let that happen again." And then, his lips crashed onto hers. Lena stood at the threshold of the library, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thorne sat by the piano, his broad frame slightly thinner, his face sharper, but his presence was undiminished. The sight of him, alive, breathing here, sent a wave of emotions crashing over her. For months, she had imagined this moment, what she would say. Now that she was standing before him, words failed her. Thorne's steel-gray eyes lifted to meet hers, sharp despite the exhaustion that lingered in his features. "You actually came," he murmured. Lena swallowed hard, forcing herself to step inside. "I wasn't sure I should." A ghost of a smile played at his lips. "And yet, here you are." She let out a shaky breath. "You sent for me." "I did." Silence settled between them, thick with everything left unsaid. Thorne gestured toward the seat beside him. "Sit." Lena hesitated, then moved toward the piano bench, her fingers grazing the polished wood. "How are you?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He huffed a low laugh. "Alive, which is more than I expected after Maxwell put a bullet in my back." The mention of Reeves made Lena's stomach turn. "They said you wouldn't see anyone." "I didn't want to." His fingers traced the edge of the piano, his expression unreadable. "Until now." Lena's throat tightened. "Why now?" Thorne exhaled, his hands clenching slightly. "Because I needed time." His voice was rough, as if admitting this cost him something. To heal, to think. Her heart pounded. "And?" He turned his head, his eyes locking onto hers. "And I couldn't stop thinking about you." Lena's breath hitched. Thorne's jaw tensed, as if waging some internal battle. "You should hate me," he admitted. "I pushed you away. I doubted you when I should have trusted you." "I don't hate you," she whispered. "Why not?" His voice was low, almost dangerous. Lena searched his face, saw the weight he carried, not just the scars on his body, but the ones deeper. The ones no surgery could fix. "Because I understand why you did it." Thorne let out a slow breath, as if he'd been holding it for months. "Then you're a better person than I am." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire. "Then?" Thorne's fingers moved toward the piano keys. Lena's breath caught as he played a single note. Then another, hesitant, searching. The melody was familiar, Chopin's Nocturne, the very song she had used to warn him that night in the factory. Lena's chest tightened. Without thinking, she lifted her hands, placing them beside his, and played. The harmony filled the room, their fingers moving in sync, 2 halves of the same melody, each note a conversation without words. Lena closed her eyes, allowing herself to sink into the music, into the unspoken emotions between them. When the final note faded, she turned to him. Thorne's gaze burned into hers. "What now?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Thorne reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a shiver up her spine. "That depends," he murmured. "On what?" A slow, deliberate smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "On whether you're willing to stay." Lena felt her pulse stumble. "And if I do?" Thorne's grip on her fingers tightened, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin. "Then we figure it out together." Her heart skipped a beat. This was it, a choice, a beginning, And for the first time in a long time, Lena wasn't afraid of the unknown. She laced her fingers with his and smiled. "Then I'm staying." Lena stood at the entrance of the library, her pulse roaring in her ears as she took in the sight before her. Thorne Blackwell sat by the grand piano, positioned near the tall windows where the Atlantic stretched endlessly beyond the cliffs. His once imposing figure had thinned, his sharp features slightly paler than she remembered, but his presence was still unmistakable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You came?" he said finally, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. Lena swallowed, stepping closer. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Thorne let out a breath, something unrateable flickering across his face. "I wouldn't have blamed you. Not after everything." The silence between them stretched, thick with unfinished words, unspoken regrets. Then, finally, he asked, "How is your mother?" Lena forced a small smile, easing into the chair opposite him. "She's doing well. Better than anyone expected. The doctors are amazed." Thorne nodded, his gaze lowering to his hands. "Good." She hesitated, then asked softly, "And you?" For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, as if pulling himself from a faraway thought, he gestured at the wheelchair. "Temporary, they say. Nerve damage takes time to heal, but I'll get there." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a hint of the Thorne she used to know. "I've been a terrible patient. Ask Mrs. Winters." "The worst," came Mrs. Winters' voice from the doorway, carrying a tea tray with her usual precision. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as cantankerous." The familiar complaint broke the tension, and before Lena realized it, she was smiling. Mrs. Winters set the tray down between them, giving Lena a knowing look before retreating, leaving them alone once more. Thorne exhaled, wheeling himself closer. "I owe you an explanation." Lena shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." His voice was steady this time, his gaze locking with hers. He looked away for a moment, as if collecting his thoughts, then finally spoke. 8 years ago, I met a woman in Vienna, a research scientist. She was brilliant, idealistic, desperate for funding. He exhaled sharply. Maxwell approached her with an offer that seemed legitimate. By the time she realized what he really wanted, patents for biological enhancements, she was trapped. His hands tightened against the wheelchair's armrests, tension rippling through his frame. "I tried to help her escape. I failed." Lena's breath caught. "She died. Officially, they called it a suicide, but I knew better." His voice darkened, the weight of past failures evident in his every syllable. "My testimony nearly destroyed Maxwell, but evidence has a way of disappearing when the right palms are greased." Lena sat frozen, the pieces finally clicking together. "So you started investigating the Amethyst Club," she murmured. He nodded. "It took years to build the case, to connect him to human trafficking, money laundering, and the auctions." His gaze flickered toward her, the memory of their first meeting in that dimly lit ballroom hanging between them. "Then I saw you on that stage." Lena inhaled sharply. "Why me?" she asked, the question that had haunted her since that night. Thorne held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Because you reminded me of her." Her heart twisted. "Not physically," he clarified, "but something in your eyes. Intelligence, strength, trapped by circumstance." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "That night, I had a choice. I could let another person disappear into that world, or I could stop it. Even if I couldn't stop everything, I could stop that." Lena's throat tightened. "So you gave me a job." Thorne nodded, his lips curving in the faintest self-deprecating smile. "And then I committed the cardinal sin of any employer." Lena tilted her head, waiting. His voice dropped, barely more than a whisper. "I fell in love with my assistant." The words hung in the air between them, thick and electric. Lena's heart pounded, her hands gripping the fabric of her coat. She wanted to say something, anything. But every thought collided into a mess of emotions she didn't know how to untangle. "When I saw those photographs of you with Vivienne," Thorne continued, "all my old fears resurfaced. Instead of trusting you, I pushed you away." He let out a bitter laugh. "I sent you straight into danger. If I had just listened." "Stop," Lena interrupted, her voice trembling. "You came for me." His eyes met hers, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Too late, and too recklessly. She shook her head. "Does it matter? You still came." He hesitated, then murmured, "Maxwell escaped. The danger isn't over." Lena exhaled sharply, already knowing what he was about to say. "That's why you kept your distance these past months," she whispered. to protect me. Thorne ran a hand down his face. Partly, but also because I needed to be sure. She frowned. Sure of what? That what I feel for you isn't just guilt or obligation or some hero complex. Her breath caught. He met her gaze, his next words carrying an undeniable certainty. I needed to know it was real. Lena's chest tightened, emotions crashing into her all at once. And is it? She whispered. Thorne's jaw clenched for a moment. Then, finally, he said it. Yes. The single word was soft but absolute, settling deep into her bones. But before he could say more, he glanced down at the wheelchair, his expression hardening. I'm not the man you met anymore, he said, his voice almost cautious now. The doctors are optimistic, but recovery will be long. I can't ask you to. Lena leaned forward, cutting him off by taking his hand in hers. Did you ever consider asking me what I want? Thorne stiffened, caught off guard. Lena. No, she said firmly. You don't get to make this decision for me. You saved me. Let me save you. His fingers tightened around hers, and for the first time in months, he let himself hope. Outside, the storm raged on, waves crashing violently against the cliffs. Inside, by the crackling fire, something stronger than fear took root. And Thorne Blackwell, who had spent years chasing revenge, drowning in past failures, finally understood. Some things were worth saving, and this time, he wouldn't let go. This expanded version keeps the emotional depth and slow-burn tension while staying faithful to the original structure and pacing. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. Play for me, Thorne requested softly, his gaze settling on the grand piano. The Chopin piece, the one you used to save my life. Lena's fingers hesitated over the keys for only a moment before she began. The familiar strains of Nocturne in E-flat major floated through the room, weaving around them like the remnants of an old dream. As the melody unfolded, she felt something shift inside her. Pieces of a fractured past settling into place, no longer jagged edges but parts of a whole. This wasn't the future she had imagined at Juilliard, but it was hers nonetheless. A new composition being written note by note. 6 months later, she played that same piece on stage with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. The concert hall was alive with the kind of electric energy only live music could summon. Her fingers danced across the keys, each note carrying the weight of every choice that had led her here. And in the front row, standing tall despite the lingering weakness in his leg, was Thorne Blackwell. He watched her, not just as a man watching a pianist perform, but as someone who had lived every note with her. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, locking in a silent conversation no one else could hear, about darkness overcome, about second chances, about love found in the most unexpected places. The wind whipped through Lena's hair as she stood at the edge of Windward's cliffside, watching gulls dive through the salt-heavy air. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before her, its deep blue deceptively calm. Behind her, the Blackwell estate had changed. What was once an austere retreat had become a vibrant home. Flowers bloomed in gardens that had once been neglected. Windows stood open to let in the sea breeze, and music flowed freely through rooms that had known too much silence. Penny for your thoughts? She turned to see Thorne approaching along the stone path, his gait still bearing a slight hitch but growing stronger each month. Physical therapy had restored most of his mobility, though rainy days still brought discomfort he tried to hide. Just thinking about time, she answered, accepting both his embrace and the warm mug of coffee he offered. How much can change in a year? Regrets? He murmured against her hair. Not one. She leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Only that I wasted so much time trying to fight this. His lips pressed a soft kiss to her temple, his former reserve replaced by an easy affection that still sometimes surprised her. Mrs. Winters is threatening to quit if we don't finalize the foundation gala details today, he mused. Lena laughed. Empty threat. She'd never abandon ship now that she's practically running everything. The Blackwell Foundation for Survivor Recovery had risen from the ashes of the Amethyst Club case, becoming a multi-million-dollar initiative providing comprehensive support to trafficking survivors, medical care, housing, legal assistance, psychological services. It was funded by Thorne's vast resources and guided by Lena's instinctive understanding of trauma and healing. Between foundation work and her growing musical career, their lives had found an unexpected rhythm. 3 nights a week, she performed with the Boston Symphony. The remaining days, they split between Nantucket and the Foundation's headquarters, working to fix problems most people preferred to ignore. Inside the house, Lena's phone chimed with the special tone reserved for urgent calls. She picked it up, her pulse quickening as she listened to the voice on the other end. Thorne watched her, concern etched in the lines of his face. "They found him," she said, setting the phone down with unsteady hands. No elaboration was needed. For 12 months, Maxwell Reeves had been a ghost, flitting through surveillance footage in Singapore, Dubai, Buenos Aires, always one step ahead of the authorities, always vanishing before they could close in. His continued escape had been the one shadow that lingered over their lives, the sword perpetually suspended above them. Where? Thorne's voice was carefully neutral, but Lena could hear the steel beneath it. She met his eyes, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. London, an island off the Maldives, international waters, but they're coordinating with. Lena stopped, studying Thorne's face. "You already knew." He exhaled, guilt flickering in his storm-gray eyes. "I got word yesterday. I wanted confirmation before telling you." Her jaw tightened. "We agreed. No more secrets." "Not a secret. A protection." He took her hands, grounding her in his steady warmth. "I know what this means to you, to us, but I needed to be certain before getting your hopes up." The tension dissolved as quickly as it had formed. This was their pattern now. Brief moments of conflict, addressed openly rather than left to fester. Boundaries established and respected, even as they sometimes tested each other's limits. "When will they bring him in?" she asked. Thorne hesitated. "That's the thing." His expression darkened. "The extraction team found him already dead, apparent suicide. Though the details are unclear, his security staff disappeared along with significant cash reserves." The news hit like a physical blow, not grief, but something more complicated. A mixture of relief, disappointment, and unresolved anger. Maxwell Reeves would never face justice in a courtroom. Never be forced to acknowledge the lives he had destroyed. Never serve a day in prison for his crimes. "I don't know how to feel," Lena admitted. "You don't have to know right now." Thorne's hand found the small of her back, a steady presence anchoring her. Whatever comes up is valid. He understood this kind of emotional limbo better than most. Over the past year, he had battled his own ghosts, anger at his physical limitations, grief for lost independence, fear that their relationship had been built on circumstance rather than genuine connection. The months of recovery had forced a level of honesty neither of them had ever experienced before. That evening, after notifying key Foundation staff and adjusting security protocols, they retreated to the library, their sanctuary. Thorne immersed himself in reports while Lena settled at the piano, fingers moving over the keys in a slow, wandering melody. "A new composition?" he asked, recognizing the unfamiliar pattern weaving itself into fragments of Chopin. "Maybe." She continued playing, eyes half closed. "It's been forming for weeks. I think I'm calling it Aftermath." The music evolved as she played, starting with discordant notes, gradually resolving into something unexpectedly hopeful. Complex, but harmonious. Thorne listened, his expression unreadable. "It's our story." "Parts of it," she agreed, fingers stilling over the keys. "The Maxwell chapter is closed, but I keep thinking about the others. Cassie, the girl still missing, the ones we haven't reached yet." Since the raid, Cassie had become one of the Foundation's fiercest advocates. Fearless, articulate, unafraid to challenge authority figures with her first-hand knowledge of trafficking realities. Her testimony had helped convict 12 of Maxwell's associates. "We can't save everyone," Thorne reminded her gently. "I know," she said, "but we can try." She turned on the bench to face him, taking a deep breath. "I've been considering the Juilliard offer." The prestigious school had approached her about a special residency program, teaching music as a healing tool for trauma survivors. It would mean splitting her time between New York and Massachusetts, a logistical challenge they had been debating for weeks. "You should take it," Thorne said, without hesitation. "You're sure?" she asked, searching his face. "It would mean more time apart." His lips curved in a knowing smile. "We've survived worse than commuting." That night, as moonlight painted silver patterns across their bedroom, Lena traced the scar on Thorne's shoulder. a permanent reminder of how close they had come to losing everything before it had truly begun. "I never properly thanked you," she whispered. "For what?" "For bidding on me that night," she exhaled, voice barely above a whisper. As strange as it sounds, it was the beginning of everything. His fingers slid through her hair, tilting her face up to his. "No," he murmured, brushing his lips against hers. "The beginning was when you played Chopin on an old PA system, and I knew I'd never let you go." The first step toward freedom. Thorne caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I think we saved each other, if we're being honest." The truth of it settled over them both. From an auction block to a symphony stage, from a wounded vigilante to a foundation director. From two lost souls to something neither had dared to dream, home. Maxwell's death didn't erase the past, but it removed the ever-present threat that had loomed over them for so long. There were no more shadows lurking at the edges of their lives, no more nights spent waiting for another enemy to strike. For the first time, they could focus entirely on the future, one they were building together. Bookmark. Lena's music flourished, her name now whispered in prestigious concert halls as one of the most captivating pianists of her generation. But beyond the spotlight, she poured her soul into the foundation, ensuring that every survivor who crossed their path found not just shelter, but dignity and a way forward. Thorne, too, changed. The man who had once lived for vengeance found new purpose, not just in dismantling the remnants of Maxwell's empire, but in rebuilding lives. The Blackwell Foundation had grown beyond his expectations, reaching further, doing more, becoming something greater than just a tool for justice. It was now a beacon for those who had once been voiceless, a sanctuary that existed because of what he and Lena had chosen to fight for. The Nantucket estate, once an austere retreat, had transformed into something different as well. Laughter now echoed through its halls. Music flowed freely from the library. Fresh flowers lined the once-neglected garden. One crisp autumn evening, Lena sat at the grand piano, her fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys. The nocturne she played was one she had composed herself, a piece woven from the echoes of their past and the promise of their future. Thorne leaned against the doorway, watching her, listening. "That's a new one," he said when the final note faded into silence. She turned to him with a soft smile. "I call it home." He crossed the room, settling beside her on the bench, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the polished wood. "Do I get to make a request?" "Depends on what it is." He took her hand in his, brushing his thumb over the ring now adorning her finger. A quiet promise, unspoken but deeply understood. "Play the Chopin," he murmured. "The one that saved my life." Lena's breath hitched at the memory. The haunting, desperate melody tapped out on an old metal panel in the heart of danger. A warning, a cry for help, a bridge between them when everything else had been uncertain. She nodded, turning back to the piano. The first familiar notes filled the room, delicate and unwavering, as Thorne closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. From darkness to light, from vengeance to hope, from survival to love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, foundation decisions, concert preparations, the endless work of healing. But for now, in this perfect moment, their unfinished symphony played on. Each day adding new notes to a composition neither could have written alone. And together, they would continue writing it, one note, one choice, one heartbeat at a time. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. From the very first note of Lena's piano to the final echoes of her and Thorne's symphony, this story has been one of resilience, love, and second chances. Your time, your emotions, and your support mean the world. Every comment, every share, and every moment spent immersed in this story is truly appreciated. Stories like this are meant to inspire, to remind us that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way forward. And sometimes, the most unexpected connections lead us to where we truly belong. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another unforgettable journey. Thank you for believing in the power of stories. Until next time, keep dreaming, keep feeling, and most importantly, keep writing your own symphony.